The rain was coming down so hard that most drivers had already disappeared from the highway, but one old pickup truck was still moving slowly along the roadside when its driver noticed two young women standing beside a silver sedan with its hood open. They were soaked, frightened, and completely alone. The driver could have kept going. Nobody would have blamed him. Instead, he pulled his truck onto the muddy shoulder, stepped out into the cold rain, and walked toward them. He had no idea that those few steps would change 3 lives forever. If you believe kindness can give people a second chance, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the beginning of something much bigger. His name was Everett Shaw, a 42-year-old mechanic who owned a tiny repair garage on the edge of town. He was not rich, handsome in any movie star sense, or particularly lucky. He wore faded work shirts, kept his dark hair short, and carried the tired expression of a man who had spent years solving other people's problems while quietly carrying his own. His garage was barely surviving, and there were weeks when he wondered whether he would have to close it. The rent had increased, customers were choosing cheaper roadside shops, and an unpaid stack of bills sat inside his kitchen drawer. But Everett had learned something from life that money had never taught him: when someone was in trouble, you helped if you could. That afternoon, he had been driving home after spending the entire day repairing an old delivery van. His hands were still stained with grease, and his back ached from bending over engines. The sky had suddenly turned dark, and within minutes the rain became a curtain of water across the road. Then he saw the silver sedan. Its hazard lights were blinking weakly, and 2 girls stood beside it, desperately trying to keep their phones dry beneath their jackets. The younger woman, 19-year-old Maren Vale, was holding a phone with no signal. Her older sister, 24-year-old Sienna Vale, was repeatedly trying to start the car. Nothing happened except a faint clicking sound. Their luggage was packed in the trunk, and the road around them was nearly empty. They had been traveling to the city for an important appointment when the car suddenly lost power. They had called roadside assistance, but the estimated waiting time was more than 2 hours. Everett looked beneath the hood and immediately understood the problem. A loose connection had caused the battery terminal to lose contact, and the heavy rain had made everything worse. It was not a major repair, but fixing it safely on the side of a wet highway was another matter. Everett returned to his truck, grabbed a small toolbox, and walked back through the rain. For nearly 20 minutes, he worked without complaining. Water ran down his face, his shirt became completely soaked, and mud covered his boots. Maren stood under an umbrella while Sienna held a flashlight from her phone, trying to give him enough light to see. Everett tightened the connection, cleaned the terminal, checked the cables, and finally stepped back. He told them to try the ignition. The engine started immediately. The relief on their faces was almost overwhelming. Sienna looked at the car, then at Everett, as if she could not believe that the stranger who had stopped for them had actually fixed the problem without asking for anything. Everett simply closed his toolbox and told them to drive carefully because the weather was getting worse. They tried to pay him. Everett refused. They offered him money for the repair, but he shook his head. They insisted again, saying they could not simply accept such a thing from a stranger. Everett finally smiled and explained that there was nothing to pay for. Years earlier, someone had stopped to help him when he was stranded on a lonely road after his own car broke down. That stranger had refused money too. Everett had never forgotten the lesson. Sometimes kindness was supposed to move forward, not backward. The sisters thanked him repeatedly. Before Everett could walk away, Maren looked at him and said something that stayed in his mind long after the rain stopped. She told him they wanted to see him again. Everett laughed softly, thinking she was simply being grateful, and said they probably would never cross paths again. Sienna smiled and told him that maybe life had other plans. Everett drove away, but the encounter kept bothering him in the strangest way. He could not explain why. Perhaps it was because he had become accustomed to people taking help without remembering the person who gave it. Perhaps it was because the sisters had looked at him as if he mattered. For a man who had spent years feeling invisible, that simple gratitude meant more than they could have known. The next morning, Everett returned to his garage expecting another ordinary day. He unlocked the doors, lifted the shutters, and started sorting through his tools. Around 10 o'clock, the same silver sedan pulled into the parking lot. Marin and Sienna stepped out carrying 2 large paper bags. Everett immediately recognized them. They had brought breakfast and coffee as a thank you. But they had not come only for that. They explained that their appointment in the city had been connected to their late mother's small community foundation, an organization that helped struggling families with emergency transportation and basic needs. Their mother had passed away the previous year, and they were trying to keep her work alive. Everett listened quietly. Their story touched something inside him because he knew what it meant to lose someone and continue living with unfinished dreams. His own father had been a mechanic, and Everett had learned the trade from him. When his father died, Everett had promised to keep the garage alive. But after years of financial trouble, he had started believing that perhaps the promise was impossible. The sisters returned several times over the following weeks. At first they came simply to thank him. Then they began asking questions about his work. They discovered that Everett often repaired vehicles for struggling families at little or no cost, even when his own business was barely surviving. He never advertised it. He simply did what he could. Marin had an idea. She suggested creating a small community program through their mother's foundation, one that would help families afford essential car repairs. Sienna agreed, but Everett immediately refused. He did not want charity. He had spent his whole life working with his hands and taking care of himself. But the sisters were not offering charity. They were offering partnership. They asked Everett to become the mechanic for the program, providing affordable repairs while the foundation covered costs for families who could not pay. They would help him obtain better equipment and promote his garage throughout the community. Everett was skeptical, but eventually he agreed to try. What happened next surprised everyone. Within months, Everett's tiny garage became known as a place where people were treated with dignity. A single mother brought in a broken car that she needed to get to work. An elderly man needed help with his brakes. A young father had an engine problem that he could not afford. One by one, people arrived, and Everett helped them whenever he could. His business began improving, but something more important happened first. Everett started smiling again. The sisters became part of his life in ways none of them expected. They helped organize community repair days, collected donated parts, and created a fund for emergency breakdowns. The little garage that Everett had once considered a burden slowly became a place filled with purpose. One afternoon, nearly a year after that stormy day, Everett stood outside his garage watching a long line of cars waiting for free safety inspections. Children were playing nearby while volunteers carried boxes of donated supplies. Sienna walked over with coffee, and Marin stood beside her, smiling at the scene. Everett looked at the busy garage and suddenly remembered the rainy highway where everything had begun. He realized that he had thought he was the one who rescued 2 stranded girls that day. In truth, they had rescued him too. They had reminded him that his life still had value, that his skills could mean something beyond earning money, and that sometimes the person who stops to help someone else is also quietly saving himself. The rain had once made that roadside feel cold, empty, and hopeless. But now, whenever Everett saw rain falling, he remembered that day differently. He remembered that kindness did not always arrive with dramatic music or grand gestures. Sometimes it arrived in an old pickup truck, wearing a soaked mechanic's shirt, carrying a toolbox. And sometimes 2 strangers could look at you after the hardest day of their lives and say, "We want to see you again," because they had seen something in you that you had forgotten to see in yourself. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes that kindness still matters, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Your support helps stories like this reach people who may need a little hope today. And before we end, I have one special request: comment, kindness never stops. Below, if you believe one good deed can change more than one life. Everett never became a billionaire. He never became famous. He never drove an expensive car or lived in a giant house. But he gained something far more valuable. He built a life surrounded by people who remembered his kindness, a community that trusted him, and two sisters who had once been strangers on a rainy roadside. Years later, whenever someone asked Everett what the most important repair he had ever made was, he never mentioned an engine, a transmission, or a broken battery. He simply smiled and remembered two frightened girls standing beside a dead car in the rain. Because that day, he thought he was fixing their car. He never realized he was helping repair three broken hearts at once. And sometimes, that is what kindness really does. It does not simply fix what is broken in front of you. It reminds you that broken things can still become beautiful again.